Subscribe my YouTube channel and stay with me, because this story is a journey through love, failure, silence, and truth. And it begins on a quiet morning when nothing seemed wrong, and that is how life always changes, without warning. I was standing in my kitchen watching steam rise from a mug of coffee, thinking about nothing important, when the phone rang, and before I answered, I felt a weight in my chest, like my body already knew what my mind had not yet heard. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, and distant, the way people sound when they deliver news that will tear someone else apart. They told me my daughter-in-law, Emily, had collapsed at work. They told me she was being taken to the hospital. They told me it was serious. And the word serious echoed inside my head long after the call ended. Emily was not weak. She was not careless. She was the kind of woman who smiled through exhaustion, who worked long hours and still found time to call her parents every Sunday. She loved my son Mark with a devotion that felt old-fashioned, even in a modern world. She believed in marriage the way people used to believe in promises, and when Mark brought her home years ago, I remember thinking he had found something rare. I grabbed my coat and keys and left the house without turning back. The drive felt endless, the road stretching ahead like a tunnel, and with every mile, memories crowded my mind. Emily laughing at the dinner table, Emily holding Mark's hand, Emily telling me she hoped to have children one day. The hospital came into view like a gray shadow, and the moment I walked inside, the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of machines told me nothing would ever feel the same again. They led me to the intensive care unit, where time moves differently, slower, heavier, as if every second has weight. And there she was, lying still, surrounded by wires and monitors, her skin pale, her eyes closed, the steady rhythm of machines doing the work her body could not. I took her hand and whispered her name, hoping she could hear me, hoping some part of her knew she was not alone. Her fingers twitched slightly, and that small movement broke me. I asked the nurse where my son was, and she hesitated before saying he had stepped out. Those words, stepped out, felt sharp like glass, because what kind of husband steps out when his wife is fighting for her life? Hours passed, and Mark did not come. I sat there, watching the rise and fall of Emily's chest, listening to the machines and feeling anger slowly replace fear. I called Mark again and again, until he finally answered. His voice sounded distracted, almost annoyed. I told him Emily was in the ICU, and there was a pause before he said she would probably be fine, that doctors always make things sound worse than they are, and he said he was busy. And that was the moment something inside me cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. I ended the call and stared at the wall, realizing the boy I raised had grown into a man I no longer recognized. That night, I did not leave Emily's side. I talked to her, even though she could not respond. I told her stories about when Mark was young, about the time he broke his arm climbing a tree and cried until she held his hand. I told her she was strong, that she mattered, that she was loved, even if the person who should have been there the most had failed her. When morning came, I left the hospital with a purpose that felt cold and steady. I drove to Mark's house and waited. When he finally arrived, he looked surprised to see me, confused more than concerned. I told him where I had been. I told him Emily was still unconscious, still fighting, and he shrugged as if this was an inconvenience. He said he needed space. He said relationships are complicated. He said things that sounded selfish and empty, and I realized he had already emotionally left his marriage long before his wife collapsed. I told him I was ashamed, not with anger, but with truth, and that hurt him more than yelling ever could. I told him love is not shown in words or excuses, but in presence and loyalty, and he had shown neither. I left him standing there and returned to the hospital, where Emily lay unaware of the storm around her. Days passed, and her condition slowly improved, but the damage had already been done, not just to her body, but to the foundation of her marriage. When she finally opened her eyes, I was there. She looked at me with confusion and fear, and the first thing she asked was where Mark was. I held her hand and told her she was safe, and that I was there, and I saw something change in her expression, a quiet understanding that something was wrong. She did not cry, she did not demand answers, she simply closed her eyes, as if gathering strength for a truth she was not yet ready to hear. And in that moment, I promised myself that no matter what happened next, she would never face it alone. Because sometimes family is not defined by blood, but by who stays when everything falls apart. And this was only the beginning of a long, painful journey that would reveal secrets, test forgiveness, and force all of us to confront who we really were when love was no longer easy. The days that followed blurred together in a slow, heavy rhythm of hospital lights and whispered conversations. Emily woke more often, her eyes gaining clarity even as her body remained weak. She smiled at me every time I entered the room, a soft, grateful smile that carried trust, and it cut deeper than any accusation could have, because she still believed in the life she thought she had built. Mark came once, late in the evening, stood at the foot of the bed, checked his phone more than her face, and left with an excuse about work. Emily watched him go without a word, and after the door closed, she turned her head toward the window, and I saw tears slide silently into her hair. She did not ask why he left. She did not ask where he went. She asked if she had done something wrong, and that question broke me because it revealed how deeply she had already begun to blame herself. I told her none of this was her fault, that sickness does not choose sides, and love does not abandon the moment it becomes inconvenient. She listened quietly, absorbing every word as if rebuilding herself piece by piece. The doctor said recovery would take time, weeks, maybe months, and when they talked about discharge plans, Mark nodded distractedly, talking about schedules and responsibilities, while Emily looked down at her hands, knowing without saying it that home no longer felt safe when she was released. I brought her to my house. I did not ask Mark for permission. I simply told him this was how it would be. And for the first time, he did not argue, because deep down he knew he had lost the right. Emily moved into the guest room, carrying only a small suitcase filled with clothes and uncertainty. The nights were the hardest. She would wake from sleep, gasping, calling his name, then catching herself and turning away, embarrassed by her own hope. I would sit with her at the kitchen table long after midnight, listening to her talk about the early days of their marriage, the dreams they had shared, the excuses she had ignored, because love makes us patient, even when patience costs us our dignity. Slowly, pieces of the truth surfaced: late nights, unexplained trips, messages hidden behind smiles, and every confession weighed heavy, but also brought clarity. She was not broken, she had been betrayed. Mark called often at first, his voice swinging between guilt and defensiveness. He promised to change, asked for time, asked for understanding, but when Emily asked for honesty, he grew silent. Weeks passed and his visits grew fewer until they stopped entirely. One afternoon, a letter arrived. No apology, no accountability, just words about needing freedom and finding himself. Emily read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table, her hands steady, her eyes dry, and that was when I knew something fundamental had shifted inside her. Grief had given way to resolve. She did not scream, she did not beg, she simply stood up and said she was done. Healing would be slow, but she would no longer bleed for someone who refused to see her worth. She began therapy, started walking every morning, even when her body protested. Strength returned gradually, not just to her muscles, but to her voice. She laughed again, quietly at first, then freely. She volunteered at the community center, helped others who felt invisible, and in helping them, she reclaimed parts of herself she thought were lost. Mark tried to come back when he realized the world does not reward selfishness the way he expected. He showed up one evening, unannounced, asking to talk. Emily listened calmly, thanked him for the lessons, and closed the door without anger, without tears. And as I watched her walk away, I felt a pride deeper than words, because sometimes the most powerful ending is not revenge, but peace. And the story was still unfolding, because healing is not a moment, it is a journey, and this journey had only just begun. Time moved forward the way it always does, quietly, without asking permission, and Emily kept moving with it, even on the days when her body felt heavy and her heart felt heavier. She enrolled in night classes, something she had always postponed for Mark, something practical, something she could build with her own hands. I would watch her sit at the dining table, books spread out, hair pulled back, determination in her eyes, and I saw a woman being reborn, not dramatically, not loudly, but steadily. The strongest kind of change comes without applause. She made friends, people who knew nothing about her past and treated her without pity. And in their laughter, she found relief from the memories that still visited her in quiet moments. Sometimes she would wake from dreams where she was back in the hospital, reaching for someone who never came. And on those mornings, she would sit on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the sunrise, reminding herself she was alive. She had survived, not just illness, but abandonment. And that realization slowly became power. Mark faded into the background of her life, not because she forced him out, but because he no longer belonged there. He sent messages on holidays, vague apologies wrapped in self-interest. She never replied, not out of bitterness, but because closure does not always require conversation. Sometimes silence is the answer. Months later, Emily received her certificate. She held it in her hands like proof that she had rebuilt something from ruins. We celebrated quietly, cake, coffee, and shared smiles. And that night, she cried, not from sadness, but from pride. She told me she had spent years shrinking herself to keep a marriage alive, and now she finally understood love should not require self-erasure. I listened, knowing I had witnessed something rare, a person choosing themselves without becoming hard. Life tested her again when her father fell ill, and she flew across the country to care for him. The old Emily would have carried that burden alone, but this time she asked for help and accepted it freely. And when her father passed, she stood at the funeral, steady, grounded, supported by friends she had gathered along the way. Grief still hurt, but it no longer defined her. Somewhere in that season, she met Daniel, not through drama, not through longing, but through coincidence. He was kind, patient, attentive. He listened without trying to fix. And for the first time, Emily experienced affection without anxiety. They took things slowly, walks, conversations, shared silence, and she learned that healthy love feels calm, not chaotic. When she told me about him, there was no fear in her voice, only curiosity and hope. And I smiled, knowing she was ready, not because she needed someone, but because she no longer feared being alone. Mark heard about Daniel through mutual friends and reached out again, this time with regret heavy in his words. But Emily had already moved beyond the version of herself that would reopen that door. She wished him well and meant it. Forgiveness had freed her more than it ever could free him. Years later, people would ask how she survived, how she rebuilt, how she trusted again. And she would say, it began the day someone stayed when they were supposed to leave, and that someone was not her husband, but her mother-in-law, who chose love over denial. And in telling that truth, she reminded others that family is sometimes found in unexpected places. And healing begins when we stop waiting for someone to choose us and finally choose ourselves. Years passed gently, not without challenges, but without the chaos that once ruled Emily's life. And in those years, she became someone people leaned on, someone whose calm presence filled rooms without demanding attention. She finished her studies, found work she loved, work that allowed her to help others navigate moments of fear and uncertainty. And every time she sat across from someone who felt lost, she understood them in a way books could never teach, because she had been there, in that quiet space where hope feels thin and loneliness feels loud. Daniel remained by her side, never rushing, never pushing, always steady. They married in a small ceremony surrounded by friends who had witnessed her journey, not a celebration of replacement, but of renewal. And when Emily walked down the aisle, there was no trembling, only gratitude for the strength she had earned. Mark was not invited, not out of spite, but because chapters once closed do not need reopening. He heard about the wedding later, and for the first time, he truly understood what he had lost. Not just a marriage, but the privilege of growing alongside someone extraordinary. Emily did not feel triumph in his regret. She felt peace, because her happiness was no longer tied to anyone else's awakening. Time softened even the sharpest memories, and one afternoon, sitting together on the porch, she told me she no longer dreamed of the hospital. The nights were quiet now, filled with ordinary joys, morning coffee, shared smiles, plans for the future. She said the hardest lesson was learning that love without presence is just a word, and that real devotion shows up, especially when it is inconvenient. I listened, knowing this story had shaped us both. She had taught me that strength can look like gentleness, and survival does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers and keeps going. People who hear her story often expect anger or bitterness, but what they find instead is clarity. She speaks of the past honestly, without shame, because she knows it forged her into who she is today. And when asked what saved her, she never names revenge or time or even love. She says it was choosing to not abandon herself when others did, and that choice changed everything. And if this story stays with you, let it be a reminder that pain does not get the final word, that loyalty reveals itself in moments of crisis, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is simply staying when the world tells you to walk away. And if this story touched you, then like, share, and subscribe, because more stories like this deserve to be told and heard.